No one sees the obvious. It's extra-large Mountain Dews. It's giant Diet Cokes. Yes, there are terrorists out there, but the biggest terrorist is that 16-ounce grape and orange soda. Now, I'm sorry if I'm getting angry, but extra-large sodas are a national public safety issue and the worst nightmare New York City faces right now. Go ahead and call me crazy. You're crazy! Actually, you're correct. Thank you all for reminding me.
Well, now there's your balanced news reporting for you.
Well, the funny thing is, that could have been him.
Isn't this really a case of misplaced priorities?
Well, I think it is as a matter of politics, but the judge just found that it was irrational, the soda ban, and that's basically that the city board of health had exceeded its authority, and that what they did is so complicated and convoluted and so fraught with political considerations in it that it became irrational, because you wouldn't know whether you could buy that 16-ounce soda literally from store to store because the criteria were so bizarre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you saw that, like, for example, you couldn't go into a bodega, a little market and buy one, like a mom-and-pop business, but, you could go to a big major retailer, like a Kroger, and purchase one. And so you could almost look at this and say, wait a minute, you're going to put the hurt on small mom-and-pop retailers, but the big businesses are going to be okay? What's going on here? Yeah,
well, it's very interesting because two of the plaintiffs here, one was the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce Coalition, which, according to the judge's decision, represents 200,000 Hispanic businesses, and the Korean American Grocers Association, which represents 4,000 Korean American-owned grocery, deli, and store owners, according to the judge's decision. So, yeah, what this basically was putting at a disadvantage the little bodegas, and if you've ever been to New York City, there are tons of Korean-owned, very small grocery-type stores, and they were two of the named plaintiffs. Everybody thinks this was the restaurant industry against Bloomberg, and they were the Restaurant Industry Association, one of the plaintiffs. But the two of the plaintiffs were essentially, as you mentioned, small store owners who were going to be disadvantaged vis-a-vis the McDonald's next door, because if you're a restaurant which serves food, you can give big portions, but if you're a to-go sort of place, a 7-Eleven or a bodega, you can't. I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah, boy, you're right about that. 6:40 is our time, 20 minutes before the hour. Professor William Jacobson from Cornell University talking about Bloomberg's soda ban being struck down yesterday. Let's get a quick look at our traffic and weather together.
Being in a committed relationship with a person is tough, but committed relationships with cars, those are easy. So head to Firestone Complete Auto Care today and keep your car running newer, longer. Maintenance, repairs, tires. Whatever you drive a Firestone. This traffic report is brought to you by Firestone Complete Auto Care.
Pretty good traffic report to start out the morning. No stalls or accidents to report right now. The weather forecast for today, mostly sunny with our temperatures in the 60s, 70s, and low 80s around the Monterey Bay and Salinas Valley, and that's our traffic and weather together. We continue with Professor Jacobson. When you talk about the disadvantaging of the smaller businesses, this is such a textbook example of, so many times how big businesses have figured out how they're going to respond to a government edict, or they've gotten a pass on it, and they either stand on the sidelines while their smaller competitors are hurt, or they actively work to create these barriers to entry for smaller competitors. And,
sure.
And this always happens.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big myths out there by people like Bloomberg and others is that more and more regulation is needed to protect smaller businesses, et cetera, from big businesses. But it actually has the opposite effect, and you see that also with the Obamacare regulations, that the companies which can afford to hire staff to comply with these onerous regulations are the ones who are at an advantage, and the smaller companies who simply can't afford the cost of compliance or run the risk of not complying are the ones who are hurt the worst. Mm-hmm. And so this is just another example, perhaps a particularly absurd example, reality but absurd, of how these regulations, which purportedly are out there to help the public, actually hurt smaller businesses.
In the judge's ruling yesterday, and you spoke to the fact that he showed the irrationality, he highlighted the irrationality of this rule and how discriminatory it was. But the judge didn't say anything at all about that the government has no business telling people that they can't have a legal product or as much of a legal product as they want. So he didn't necessarily really come down on, say, the civil rights of the end user. His was more concerned about the impacts on the businesses, small and large.
Well, his decision, and it was very detailed. It's 35 pages. First examined whether the New York City Board of Health, which passed this regulation, had the ability to do so, the power to do so, or whether it had, in a sense, substituted itself for the New York City Council, which is the city legislature. And because this was not something passed by the city legislature, this was something passed by essentially a department under the control of Bloomberg. And so the judge found that they did not have that authority, that under the city charter, dating back, and the judge followed it back to the 1800s. Under the city charter, the Board of Health only has jurisdiction over over food to the extent it's a health emergency. So if there was, an outbreak of salmonella or something like that, they would have jurisdiction to come in and take action. But the judge said nobody had demonstrated that the so-called obesity crisis was such an emergency. And so essentially the judge, most of his decision, 20 or 25 pages of his decision, is going over the history of the New York City Charter and what authority there was, and the judge found that there was no authority to enact this sort of regulation. Then the judge turned to the absurdity of it and whether, giving due deference to the city Board of Health and to the city agencies, whether there was any rational basis for it, and found that there was none, that it was so, had so many loopholes in it that it became arbitrary and capricious. So yes, the judge never reached the issue of whether somebody has a right to buy this soda. The judge focused on whether the government, in this case the New York City Board of Health, acting at the request of the mayor, had the power to do this. Mm-hmm. So, I think the judge approached it from that direction, which I think in many ways is a more logical way to approach it. Perhaps if the judge had found that they had the authority and had found that it wasn't irrational, perhaps there might have been some third level of analysis as to whether it somehow violated somebody's rights, but didn't need to get there and never addressed it, as you indicate.
Okay, and also when the judge made this decision, it sounded like, and as you've described it, that it was improper for the executive branch of New York City government to do this. So does that mean that if the city council in New York decided to legislate this, enact it, and in a less discriminatory way, it would withstand legal scrutiny?
Well, of course, the judge doesn't get that far, but the import of the ruling, I think, is if this had been done in a different way and had been a more rational. For example, if every single drink in New York City were limited to less than 16 ounces, who knows how the judge might have decided. But one of the things the judge found to be irrational is that you ban, as defined in the rule, sugary drinks, but you don't ban milkshakes, you don't ban lattes, you don't ban other things which actually have higher calories. So what is if obesity control or addressing the obesity problem were some legitimate government, regulatory concern, how is it that you ban 16-ounce sodas but not 16-ounce milkshakes when the milkshakes actually have higher calories? Mm-hmm. So that was just another example of the judge finding it to be completely irrational. One kind of side thing I had heard is that apparently a number of the Starbucks and other, coffee-type places that have chains were already preparing what they're going to do because they would not be allowed to add sugar to large coffees to go. So iced coffee. So if you had ordered a 20-ounce iced coffee and you wanted it with sugar, they couldn't do that under this regulation. Just another example. So they were going to have to deal with how they're going to train their people not to put sugar in your iced coffee if you order a large iced coffee to go. It's just another example of how irrational it was. But, of course, nothing would have prevented you from going to the counter and pulling 5 packets of sugar and pouring it in yourself.
Right.
Just completely irrational. Nothing here would have prevented you from buying 2 12-ounce sodas instead of 1 16-ounce soda. So the whole thing was just so irrational that the judge said that not only don't you have authority, but even if you did have authority, you can't do this.
Right. And what about the size issue? Like, well, why 16 ounces? Why not 15? Why not 12? Why not 7? I mean, isn't the issue of nothing more than a 16-ounce drink, isn't that capricious in and of itself?
Yes, and the judge found there was no restriction on refills. So they could, I mean, it was crazy. This is what happens when somebody, thinks he's all powerful, like Bloomberg does, and thinks that he can just do whatever he wants. And I certainly don't think he ever expected a court to get in the way. I presume they will appeal this. So this was a decision by a New York State Supreme Court justice.
Right.
In New York State, the Supreme Court is the trial court. It's not like in the federal system. It's not the highest court. So this can be appealed, and I presume Bloomberg will appeal. And we'll see it would now go to the appellate division of the New York State Supreme Court, and so we'll see what they do. But the decision was very well written. This was not an off-the-cuff sort of reaction by the judge. Like I said, it's 35 pages. It traces the history of the New York City Charter. I think I said the 1800s. I think the judge goes farther back than that. I think to the beginning of time, to the late 1600s or something like that. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a very well-written decision. The judge expressly did not, express an opinion on whether, addressing the obesity issue is a good thing or a bad thing. He did not address the issue of whether that should be left to individuals. Judge just basically said, here's what they did. Did they have the power to do it? And did it have some rational theme to it, and found on both cases that it did not.
Well, Bloomberg seems like a rather humorless man as well. I note that there's a video on the web out there. I can't remember if it was Breitbart or one of these other, maybe James O'Keefe of Veritas, but one of those organizations, they caught up with Bloomberg in Washington, D.C. at some event that he was at, and it was to ask him about gun control, and that he's a big proponent of gun control, yet he's surrounded by armed guards, right?
Right.
And the person who approached him, they had a camera in the background. The guy was he was dressed in some sort of a, disguise type outfit, but trying to get a couple of words in with Bloomberg, and he's holding a giant Coke in one hand and a microphone in the other.
Yeah, I mean, I don't begrudge an official, government official, from having security. And while that one was kind of humorous, I remember that video. I think it was not O'Keefe. It was it Breitbart? Jason Matera.
That's right, Jason Matera. Yes,
that's right.
Okay.
And I think that somewhat trivialized the issue. I do think government officials have a need for security, but why they want to take it away from other people is really the issue.
That's a great point.
So. But this one is just so irrational, and there's a great New York Post cover today.
I saw that.
Which I posted at the blog. It's all around the internet. New York Post, when these things happen, nobody does a better cover than the New York Post.
You're right about that. Professor William Jacobson, legalinsurrection.com is the website. Go there and check it out. We'll put a link to it on our Facebook page. And Bill, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Great.
All the best with you.